All right, so the goals for today, and these aren't, like I said, we don't have to go into depth in any of these, or some of these may be things that we might want to skip, but my goals when I put this together were just a couple of tips and resources for improving learner content retention, to kind of have some thoughts about sight words, some physical tools for working with students with learning differences, and then just some other tools and resources that we have at Literacy Pittsburgh that are for y'all's disposal. So one of the things that I hear, I have a lot of conversations with tutors, and the tutors come to me and they say, Christina, my student, we're working, we get to the end of a sentence and it's like they can't remember what was at the beginning of the sentence or what the paragraph or the article was about. Megan, have you had that happen at all with your student, or is this kind of?
Yeah, I asked her to read it, and 5 seconds later she said she's read it, but then she doesn't know anything.
She doesn't remember anything,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Has anybody here tried to learn a foreign language as an adult?
No.
So I have done this, and I have to tell you that when I was learning Portuguese, and I'm not like some great prolific Portuguese speaker, it's my like third language, so it's probably the weakest of the languages that I speak. But one of the things that's really hard when you're working with that is that if you're struggling with the words on the page, it's really hard for your brain to like process what you're reading. Even if you understand the words, it's like a fluency issue. Like your brain just isn't connecting the words or the ideas together. We also find with our students, and we see this all the time, that the students who are like working 2 jobs, have 3 kids, they're already completely spread thin. So they show up at tutoring, they're tired already anyway, and that can definitely also affect retention issues. I have some tutors who have started doing mindful activities at the beginning of their sessions. And while that sounds ridiculous, just even like getting the students to kind of calm down and focus on the issue at hand can go a long way in kind of redirecting their focus, and making sure also that they know that tutoring time is like learning time, and sometimes putting their phones, like even as simple as flipping them upside down, which again sounds like common sense, but these are all issues I think I know I've dealt with in working with students. So one of the things, I know I just said this, but retention is very commonly an issue when students are still learning how to read. Even when they have a higher degree of fluency, if their brain isn't like connecting the words together, they may still be decoding, or they may be so focused on getting to the end that they're not paying attention. Definitely keep practicing. That's one of the kind of solutions to this. The learner's likely going to benefit from reading more at home. And I'm going to sound like a broken record telling people to get your learners to try to read something at their house. Megan, in your particular situation, it sounds like it might actually be beneficial to, and I'm sure you're doing this, to try to get the student to slow down. And that may be just at the end of every sentence for like the first next few weeks, having her, what just happened? What did you just read? So that she kind of gets in the habit of thinking about what she's reading instead of glossing over it.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes the content is too difficult when you have a student who's not retaining information. And this is kind of a struggle, right? Because I kind of call this the Goldilocks challenge, where you want your learner to be challenged by what they read, but you also don't want to make it so overwhelming that they don't know, that they can't retain anything. So it's kind of like finding the perfect content that's not too hard and not too easy. It can be useful though, especially if you're trying to develop fluency or increase retention, to at some point in your tutoring sessions, step down some content. And that could be as simple as maybe you're working out of like Journey to Success. Maybe you're on unit 2. It can be as simple as going back to unit 1 and rereading something, or it can be getting material from your program coordinator or from the internet that's like a step down, and that to focus at that point on paying attention while also increasing fluency. And those two skills they're hard to kind of manage at the same time. So it's a little bit of a balancing act to teach them to, hey, we're going to try to increase fluency while we also understand what we're reading. because it's really easy to have a student read very slowly and understand things, or read very quickly and not understand anything. So you kind of have to work to make sure that those two pieces are kind of constantly building up together. And it also, this is another challenge that we see. It's reading
I'm
to-
sorry, I have a puppy, so I'm sorry for the,
No problem, no problem. I have
Okay.
a cat that may come and join me soon.
I'll be back in a minute.
No
so-
problem. But sometimes you also might be reading too much before asking your student to process anything. And that can be a really big, that's a very common issue that we see. So when that happens, it can be really beneficial to ask the students to recap what they're reading more frequently using their own words, which again, I'm sure you guys are doing, but it's just always a good reminder. So I like to make retelling the story part of the routine. So if a student reads a paragraph, like, tell me about it. What do you remember? Then what happened? If you're with them, I advocate taking your hand and covering the text, like forcing them to look up and think about what they just read. And sometimes it's the act of doing that kind of over and over again that teaches the student to start processing these things internally. If you have a student who's really struggling with the reading, like if they're reading it and they're just stumbling over every word, you can do something that we call it scaffolded reading. And that's where, like, you read the first half of the sentence, they read the second half. Or if you have a student that's, maybe you ask them to look at a sentence or a paragraph and pick out the words that they know, pick out the words that they know they don't know. And maybe when they get to the words that they don't know, you're there to kind of read with them, to say it out loud. So if they're reading out loud, they get to a word they don't know, you read it for them. And then
Is there
also,
go
ahead.
Sorry. Is there any benefit to having them write down a little synopsis? So say they read 3 sentences, to write down like, boy went to the store or whatever, if that's
if they're comfortable doing it. If they're not there yet, that might be, if you have a really low level student. We don't have a ton of students who are so low that they couldn't do that. But yes, I think it's an excellent practice to kind of take, if you've got like a paragraph or like a series of sentences, it's helpful just even to have them write down a couple of words to help jog their memory. They are allowed to write in the books that we give them. I want them writing in the books that we give them. So that is actually, Anne, a really good thing to kind of encourage them to just get in the habit. And as they're building up on the content, so if you have a student that's working towards like GED or high set, they actually, doing that is helping them get in the habit of note taking. That's kind of like the earliest forms of note taking. So yes, that can be really helpful.
thanks.
It's also really important to just keep stressing the importance of reading at home. I like to tell students 5 minutes is fine, especially at the lowest level, depending on what level your students are at. We have students in the adult basic education program from beginning literacy, which are students who are really at like the fundamentals of literacy, all the way through an advanced level, right? If they're at the advanced level, they should be reading like 20-30 minutes a night. Are they going to? I don't know, but all research tells us that they're going to do better, retain more, and pass those tests if they're reading at home. And it can be reading anything if they're kind of at that advanced level. The lower level reading, the students at those levels, the difficulty that we have is finding them level appropriate content. And this is, I think, a struggle that a lot of adult learning programs struggle with, is just finding content that's not too childish, doesn't include a bunch of like cartoons of mothers and their kids or like 2 kids playing. So if the lower levels, so beginning literacy, beginning, and then lower intermediate, which are kind of like the lowest 3 levels that we have a really good book here over here. I have it here. It's called City Stories. City Stories is a great book. I don't know, Megan, this might be too low for your student, but if it isn't, you're welcome to request it. It has 4 levels, and it goes from like very basic to kind of like a low intermediate level of reading. The woman who wrote this book she was an adult educator. She got really frustrated at what was available for her. And she ended up writing a book for adult beginning literacy that was about adults. It's about immigrants, it's about other adults. Each level is kind of like, each unit is kind of a different level of reading. So obviously it starts at level 1, moves up to level 4. And you can see level 1 has like 1 and 2 syllable words. It's written in a way that it's mainly sight words and words that are really easy to sound out. And then I think I put, you can see at the bottom here, this is an excerpt from level 3 or level 4. And you can just kind of see that this gets more complicated. The thing that we like about this is that this book, when you look at it, like this bottom chunk down here with where it says Claire was a student from New York City, that's a paragraph of text. But when students are really learning how to read and they're still developing fluency, periods and punctuation can actually kind of throw those students off. So this text starts every sentence, it puts it all the way over to the left of the page. And when the sentence ends, if it doesn't bleed over into the next line, it just starts a new sentence below it. And this, especially for people who are not used to reading a lot, this can be a really easy way or a really good way to build up their fluency before they move over to books where paragraphs look like what we know paragraphs to look like. The other thing I like about this book, there's a teacher's guide and there's also a workbook. The teacher's guide does a really good job of kind of previewing what punctuation is going to be used that might be new, what vocab words you might want to preview, and then which sight words are going to be in there that you might want to be able to cover with your student. The workbook, it's only available as a download online. It's just kind of the way this series is. I can't get physical copies of it, so you have to have access to a printer. But we are finding, especially for our beginning level and even the low intermediate students, the ones that learn kinesthetically, so they learn best by touching things, these dotted line tracing look really, they look like that they belong in like an elementary school, but there's actually a lot of research that shows that students who learn through kinesthetics, who our students are, this is actually a really good way for them to retain new words. And you can do the dotted line method with any word. So this can be useful for them too. Again, you have to have access to a printer for this, but the actual storybooks we have in hard copy and we can mail to you and your student if you think that they'll work. All right, sight words. This is a little bit of a conversation. So what do you guys know or think sight words are? Does anyone want to give a guess? I have a 7-year-old and I'm dealing with this right now. What are sight words, Anne? I saw that you just unmuted yourself.
Sight words are frequently occurring words that appear in all texts, like and, if, the, things like that.
Okay, that's definitely, I think that was what I thought of sight words as. I can't see Megan, is she still here?
Yeah, I'm here. Sorry.
It's okay, as a presenter, it's hard for me to see who's here and who's not.
Yeah, the dog, I shut the door to the dog, so we're all good.
You sound like me. So what do you think of as sight words?
I just think that those are words that somebody at a certain age level, speaking in average educational terms, should know. Words that repeat over and over again. And I don't know if I'm right or not, like cold, hot, words like that.
Yeah, and this is where this gets interesting because there's oh, hold on. All right, so there's a couple of definitions of this. My background is working with English language learners from of all shapes, sizes, education levels, from over 90 different countries. So I have English language learners are kind of the people that I work the most with. It's only been in the last 5 years that I've worked more with adult basic ed. And it's interesting because I used to have to teach spelling conventions to students from China. And it's interesting because I think when I walked into teaching, I thought sight words, right? These are, they kind of have to do with age level reading, but I didn't really understand because I started coming up with this other term that was high frequency words. So high frequency words are words that are the most common words in the English language. Sight words is a subset of high frequency words that do not fit standard phonetic patterns. And they're just not easy for students to decode without just memorizing them. And so I had to look this up today or yesterday. I don't remember. All the days are the same anymore. But so there's a lot of statistics that you can find online, and people will say, 50% of English words are like regular, meaning they follow, there's like a shorter list of rules that you can kind of memorize to figure out how to decode the word, how to say the word. 30% follow a rule within one letter. So the letter, maybe one letter in the word is not necessarily standard. So that means 50% of the words a student can kind of stumble through and sound out. 30% may be closer to what it is that you're thinking of, it like what I think of as sight words. And the remainder are just classified as irregular. So you've got about 20% of the language that just essentially shows up. They don't really have spelling conventions, which means they don't really have pronunciation conventions. And this drives me crazy as somebody who studied linguistics, because we get these lists and we're like, oh, somebody put these together. These lists are based on, I think it's a 4th grade. These are these lists of sight words that you can find. You can actually find them by level. You can find them by grade. And it is good to use, there's tons of these lists online. All of them are good. None of them are right. None of them are wrong. It is good to go through these with your students. You can actually look up like high frequency words for like 10th graders if you're working with a student at a higher level, and even just putting those into flashcards or working with your student to make sure that they know the high frequency words can be good. I get driven crazy. Again, my kid comes home and he's, people are telling me like, oh, just teach him phonics. And I'm like, phonics is good for like really short words. But as soon as you start getting into vowel blends, combinations, and these types of words that we're looking at, you've got rough, tough, and stuff, right? 2 words with the same spelling, another one with a different spelling. Ought, thought, and taught, which in my brain, none of those look alike. And kite, height, and might. When you start getting into these, it is actually useful to start teaching your students, like these are kind of spelling conventions, but they're also when a student is reading, especially when they're having to read out loud, it's almost like teaching them pronunciation conventions. Students hate the word spelling. Most of our students didn't do well in spelling, but just teaching them that there are these rules that are going to help them decode and say the words when they encounter them can help them learn the spelling conventions, if that makes sense. Don't call it spelling. None of our students liked spelling. Most of them were not good at it. Does anybody know this word? Has anyone ever seen this? And
No.
do you know this one? This is,
Sorry, now I don't know that word.
This shows up, I think, in Finnegan's Wake, maybe, or it's a James Joyce novel. This was in the 1800s. There were people who were arguing that English was ridiculous with the way that we spelled things. There were too many ways to spell the sounds that we had. And so somebody came up with this like large list of very creative ways of spelling things. So this is actually the word fish, if you can believe it. It's an alternate spelling that some linguists came up with. And if you look at it, the GH like tough, the O like in women, and the TI like in nation. And then you look at it and you're like, well, yeah, no wonder my student hates reading, because reading is hard. And there's a ton of rules. And this is why I had a mentor who kind of advised that really most of reading is really learning sight words. That's a lot of what we're doing is basically memorizing these things. We're memorizing shapes, patterns, combinations. So it's actually not a bad thing when you're looking at like vocab lists. I think vocab lists are something that we always associate with English language learners, but it can be really, really helpful, especially for students who are working on, I'm so sorry, I just lost my train of thought. Students who are working on fluency and just really working on decoding, it can be really good to kind of have these lists of sight words that you're working with your student on. Vocabulary building comes from exposure. So I like to advocate keeping lists that your student is coming up with in places like Google Drive so that you can kind of access them together. It's kind of like they're building up their own independent dictionary. It is helpful for them. I have found this with ABE students. This is something that I do with English language learners. I have them write out how it is that they think the word should be pronounced. So if they are looking at a word, let me see if I can, do you guys know, I'm going to put a word in the chat. This word drove me crazy when I was younger. Do you guys all know this word? I just dumped it in the chat.
Yeah.
Okay, that is a word in English that there is like not rhyme or reason as to why. It's from French, I think, and that's why it's colonel, like the colonel in the army. But that drove me crazy when I was in high school, and I finally had to write down next to the word, colonel, I had to write kernel, like kernel of corn. And that's how my brain was able to kind of memorize that was how you said that word. And it can be helpful for sight words to have your students like phonetically, the way that they think it's spelled, sounded out. I have tutors all the time who come to me and they're like, my student and their spelling. And I'm like, spelling is hard. It's not something that I think we can necessarily teach, but spelling is essentially learning patterns and it's learning sight words. So flashcards are also great. I'm a big advocate of those too. And I can show you guys, I found, we used to use Quizlet for flashcards, but they make you pay now. So I found another website for flashcards. I would definitely say too, when you're doing something like keeping a list of sight words, it can help to take that list every once in a while and try to find patterns in the way that that the words are pronounced, find patterns in the spellings of the words. That can help the student sometimes physically just moving the words between lists or like pronunciations. It can help them categorize the words inside their heads. And again, if you've ever worked with a low-level reader, when you see them kind of stumbling through a word that you're looking at and you think inside your head, well, this is just how you say this. But when you try to come up with the rule for why you say it, it can be very hard. And it's sometimes easier to show them lists of words that have similar pronunciations. It can help them see that there's patterns. Sometimes there isn't patterns and you just need to memorize them. And calling them something else, I think another thing, students think sight words, they think of like little kids. So you can call them snap words, knowledge words, quick words, whatever you want to call them if the student seems really turned off, if you're like, let's do some sight words, which I totally respect. All right, any questions? I want to take a second here. I feel like I'm giving you guys a lot of information.
You said there was a website for flashcards?
I'm going to show you that at the end.
At the end, okay. I've noticed with my student, she doesn't comprehend if I say read it to yourself in your head. She always has to read it out loud, even if it's in a whispering tone. So if that works, that works. Just kind of let her do that.
I would say so. That is actually so that is, and you're going to put me on the spot for remembering. There is actually specific learning differences where those students do better, like reading out loud. That will be an issue if she needs the GED, because you're like, if she takes the test online, she's not allowed to do that. But
okay,
we might be able to, I think she can whisper read if she takes the test in person. And I can double check on that for you. With our partners over at Goodwill, who are actually proctors of that test, and they can tell me. But we recently had a student almost get kicked out of her testing session online for reading out loud because they don't know if you have like a recording device somewhere in the room and they worry that you're stealing the questions.
Yeah.
Really, really common though, Megan. That is something you will hear a lot of.
And that's interesting. Yeah. Well, anyway. Yeah.
So this is something then it sounds like, Megan, you were telling me your student rushes through things. She's reading out loud. She sounds like she might be like a more kinesthetic learner too. Students who read out loud, sometimes that's like a way of like another way of processing the words. So she may need to do that. The big three when we talk about when we talk about learning differences, we talk about dyslexia, dysgraphia, and dyscalculia, excuse me, dyscalculia. Dyslexia is interesting because I think everybody thinks that it's like letters flipping on the page, but it's not necessarily what it is. It can be that. It can be that the letters are going to move around, but it can also just be issues with word recognition, decoding, and spelling. Dyscalculia, the one on the bottom, is like, if you've ever worked with a student that just is absolutely struggling to understand basic math facts and computations, that can actually be a sign of a learning difference. Like, not just that they're not getting it, but there may actually be a reason that they're not getting it. And dysgraphia, it was interesting when this is the one that I know the least about. And it was interesting while I was reading the definition, and I read an article about it yesterday, so I could, I was like, well, I know that we have students who have this, but I'm not quite sure what it is. And I realized after reading the article, they were describing me. I was like, oh my gosh, I had this. The classes I failed in grade school were handwriting and spelling. Like, my writing, yeah, my handwriting is atrocious. And if you ever see me handwrite something, I'm automatically going to like retype it because nobody can read it. And they now have accommodations for that. Like, I wouldn't have had to fail classes when I was a kid for doing that. Some other ones, ADHD, like issues with focus on activity and hyperactivity. Megan, you were saying your student, it sounds like she might have some ADHD. Whether or not she's going to be able to get diagnosed is questionable. Executive functioning, this is another thing I think a lot of our students really struggle with. They just don't know that it has a name. And these students have challenges planning, following through with things, organizing, and time management. And then dyspraxia is another one that you might have. And this is usually students who have like cognitive issues. So this is issues with movement. So these students aren't necessarily going to be able to like hold a pencil, or maybe when they're writing, their numbers don't look like numbers or their letters don't look like letters. But if you have students who are kind of exhibiting some of these things, it can be helpful just to Google like how to work with executive functioning in adults, how to work with ADHD. We are not experts on this. We don't expect you guys to be experts on this. We don't expect you guys to like fix your learners, diagnose. And a lot of them don't even know that they have these challenges, and maybe working with you is the first time that somebody's going to give them this much time or energy. Just so you guys have in your list of tools, I know for me, I need, one of the things that happens sometimes is we have students who show up with a notebook, if they even show up with a notebook. And frequently they're showing up with notebooks with like no lines on them. And then I get them when they're taking notes or they're writing things, everything's like completely disorganized. And so one of the first things I always ask the tutors are, does their notebook have lines in it? Which sounds ridiculous, but it is actually, it's a thing. And it's making sure also that the lines are big enough. If you're working with somebody who's kind of earlier in the process, we can get the 3-lined paper. Graph paper can be really useful for students who have a hard time putting spaces between words, which is a thing. And then making sure that a student, if they do have lined paper, that they, there's college ruled and there's wide ruled, get them to use the wide ruled paper. If your student thinks that they might be dyslexic, this is a thing. There's a lot of controversy about whether or not this is like bunk science, but these color filters that we have can work really well. Some of the students that we have with dyslexia swear by these. They swear that this helps with the contrast on the page and it helps them be able to focus on the words better. So if you ever have a student who tells you that they're dyslexic, ask your program coordinator for the color overlays and just see if they work. And if they don't, it's fine. But if they do, that may be a tool for your student. This font is I don't know if you guys have ever seen this, but I have, again, 7-year-old learning how to read. So these letters across the bottom, the D, the B, the P, and the Q are absolutely stifling him. And so I started printing out some of what he was reading in this free font called Open Dyslexic. And this can be really good, not just for students with dyslexia, But any sort of students who, if they seem like they're skipping words, or I'm not even sure like all the ranges, but we're seeing success with having tutors download this font. You can just Google it. It's called Open Dyslexic. And you put it onto Microsoft Office, and then you dump the text through, like you just change the text, and it changes the letters just enough that our learners' brains are able to like really differentiate between the shapes. And so you can see the difference between these lowercase letters down here. They look different, and they're more quickly able to tell the difference between them. So again, free resource. Megan was asking about this. Let me go to StudyStack. We'll start here. So I found this website called studystack.com. They do have like a paid service, but this website, you can create flashcards with this. And flashcards work. The thing with sight words, right, is that if your student is not the strongest reader, how are, you know, it's kind of hard to like put a definition on the back of a sight word, because it's more words that they have to read. So if you're using this, it might be useful just to show it up on the screen and have the student try to say it out loud. And I think that might be the way to go with these, with the lower level. With higher level students, you can have them write the definitions kind of in their own words so that they're easier. And they just go through and say, I didn't know this, I knew this one, and then to see how many they have left. Oxford Bookworm readers, these are great. You take these are for like emergent readers. These have 6 levels of reading, including through like kind of a more advanced level. And these are like classic stories, right? Aladdin, Tom Sawyer, these are mainly things that are out of copyright. And they are written using essentially like those word lists for different levels. So the lowest level readers are going to have 400 words or less in them. And it really, working with these can help the students gain fluency, but also gain confidence. So we have a placement test that they take. They figure out what level they're in. Once we take it, we send you like a shorter list of like 20 or 30 books. You pick them, we order them. You and your reader go to town reading them. I have some high beginning, low intermediate students that are like obsessed. They've read all of the Sherlock Holmes series of this. Another group of immigrants out in Carnegie who just got finished reading Frankenstein. So these are really good books for emergent readers. Readworks is another great website because you can actually, you have to sign up for an account, but it's free. You can just put in that you're an educator. If you need to know like approximately what level your student's reading at, if you reach out to your program coordinator, they can tell you, and you can find just like lists of texts in here at the different level. And what I like about these is that this has the ability it has audio with the reading. So you can read through it, and then the audio actually shows, and you can have your student listen while they're reading along, which can really help them. This is made for children. So you will see, like I selected the 2nd grade. Some of these you'll see like sore winner, sore loser. Don't pick those, obviously. But the ones on like Adobe Homes, history, architecture, you kind of have to preview them, but a lot of tutors and students really like what's coming off of these websites. And again, this goes all the way through 12th grade. So you can kind of keep using this website as a resource. Another thing that we do recommend for kind of emergent readers is to record your learner reading out loud periodically. When students are progressing through reading, it can feel really, really slow. They can get really flustered really easily. And it's really hard for both you and your learner sometimes to forget how much progress they've made. So it can be good just like once a month, just be like, hey, we're just gonna like take stock of where you're at. And maybe after 5 or 6 months to go back to that first recording and really see like what a difference they're making, what type of content they're reading, how much faster they're reading, maybe their fluency is improved. And this can kind of work at a lot of levels. Because I think a lot of our students, even the ones who are working on like GED stuff, they get really flustered because this process can take a long time. And so this is like a little reminder that they are actually improving. All right, so I think Megan just said something that's really important. If something's working for your learner, keep doing it. Like, they're not hurting anyone. It works, do it. Going too fast can be a problem. So can going too slow. So kind of finding that Goldilocks, and then knowing when it's time to push your student and knowing when it's time to pull back. Those are all, this all kind of comes from experience, and you guys will kind of get a feel. Each student is a little bit different, and they're going to kind of let you know, but letting them know that they can tell you when they need to slow down or speed up. And I always tell everybody, if you have a student who's doing something and it's like, well, it's working for them, but that's not the easiest way to do it. I'm always like, sometimes it's easier to work around the mountain than to try to go over it. So breaking what I term or somebody else terms as bad habits. If a student's doing something and it works and it's something they can do on the GED, or like it's not hurting them or anyone else, I'm like, go for it. Because I have so much respect for the learners who come to us, because I think it takes a lot for them to come in and ask for the help that they're getting with us.